Good. So let's now jump into what we discussed yesterday and continue on this. So on Friday last week, we started talking about inheritance. And then yesterday we had this working example. And we concluded the lecture by studying what happens for constructors. If you have a child class that is inheriting a parent class, simply what order the constructors get called and what constructors exactly get called, right? So just to refresh your minds from yesterday, if you remember, we had a parent class that is called point. So here we have the header file of the point class. What matters here is we added a couple of pointers. We added the default constructor, which is this one. And just inside the default constructor, we only added a message to identify that this constructor is being called right now. That we say, well, inside point class constructor default. And then we added another constructor that simply takes arguments as an input for initialization. And then we said inside constructor 2 to just say that this constructor is being also called if it's called. And then in the point 3D, which is the child class, we simply added just the empty constructor, but we wanted to, let's say here, we implemented the constructor itself in the implementation file. And here we say we are inside the point 3D class, right? That's the constructor. And by just doing this and commenting out calling of any parent constructor here, if you remember yesterday, when we go to the main and we instantiate an object of the type child point 3D, and we try to run this program, what you find is that you in fact get two messages, not one. You get the message from inside the default constructor of the parent, which is inside point class constructor default. And then we get the message from the child constructor, which is inside the point 3D class. And the reason for this, if you remember from yesterday, is that all the time when you create an object of type child, in fact, an object of type child is also of type parent. And this is the reason we call the constructor, the default constructor of the parent first, and then we call the default constructor of the child. And this happens by default. And then we added one additional step and saying, if you really, in fact, want to call a different constructor of the parent, you can do this inside the constructor of the child itself. And we try this by having this line of code here, by calling explicitly the point constructor that passes in arguments for initialization, right? Then when we try to do this and we run, what we found is that you get the default constructor still being called, and then the second constructor for initialization, and lastly, the constructor of the child. Good. So simply the order of calling is you always call the default constructor and then any constructor, because this is the first line of your child constructor here, and then you bring the message from the child constructor itself. This is basically where we stopped yesterday. Is there any question related to this? Does this make sense? So again, the takeaway message here is that the order of calling constructors is you call the parent and then the child one. Now the question comes is, what if in fact I have, well, a hierarchy of parents? Because we said inheritance does not stop in a parent class and a child class. You might have in fact a grandchild where you inherit the child class itself. So the child class works as a super class or a parent class for another class. How does this work? So let's just quickly try this out by in fact defining another class. Maybe we can call a point 4D. And then in this parent class, I will make it point 4D. I will make it to inherit the point 3D class. Okay. And then what I'm going to add is maybe, let's say, protected, it doesn't really matter now. Maybe we add a fourth coordinate. Remember that point 2D was an XY in the Cartesian coordinate, and then point 3D added the third coordinate Z. Maybe here we add, I don't know, a fourth coordinate, let's say T, for example. And well, for now, this is in fact might be it, but also let's add a constructor for this one to know that we have called the constructor of this grandchild. And then in this case, I will add a point 4D constructor. Then I will also do it in line. Then in that case, what I'm going to write is inside point for the constructor. Okay, good. So if we do this, and if I go to the main, well, there is one thing I'm really forgetting here, which is you are using the point 3D class, which means you should in fact include the header file of this class, right? Because otherwise you cannot really use it. And then in the main, to be able to instantiate objects out of your 4D class, you should also include the header file of this one, which by default will include the 3D one, and then in turn it will include the point one. Great. So what we want to focus on is assume I want to create an object instead of point 3D, I'm going to create an object of point 4D. And I'm not even going to set anything. I'm just creating the object as is, right? Because we know from before that the constructor gets called when you create the instance, right? When you instantiate the object. So regardless of, well, using this object, right? So let's see what do we get. So I will run. Oh, I guess I'm doing something wrong here, which is just really terminating the class definition. So in that case, if you see what happens is you print first the grandparent point class default constructor. And then if we just forget about constructor 2 for now, the one that we called by default here, let's just comment this line out. And then I rerun just to make the message cleaner. So simply I first print the point class constructor, the point 3D class constructor, and then the point 4D constructor. So the order again comes from the grandparent, the parent, and then the child. So it always follows the inheritance hierarchy in terms of what order you call these things in. Is that clear? Is there any question? So basically, this was the last thing that we wanted to cover in related to constructor calling and what order they get called when you really have a hierarchy of inheritance.